of you who have joined here for this really, really interesting talk or the topic about the great battle of the sexes. Are women better leaders than the men are? And of course, there's nothing better than looking at evidence to be able to answer that question. And Professor William Obenauer from the University of Maine published a paper recently in the Leadership Quarterly uh, 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 on this topic, and that is how we thought we would invite him to talk about his research and to possibly take us closer to answering the question. Professor Billy Obenauer got his PhD from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and he's currently a full-time faculty in the School of Business at the Ithaca College in the University of Maine. He has some interesting work that he does on DEI and has interest in looking at how research design influences our understanding of DEI. Which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I'm sure to the audience knows that it's not a very nice word today in some parts of the world, but continues to be an interesting topic for all of us as researchers to look at. And he's somebody who has, he has a core value in his teaching style, which includes transparency, equitable access to education, and that no one should be defined by their worst day. And I think that is such an interesting thing because that also is something that many of us as teachers possibly need to remind ourselves every day. And so thank you for, highlighting that as part of your introduction, Billy. I will not spend too much time discussing about his achievements and his papers because that might take the whole hour. And we have a very short time to actually just talk about this topic. So I'm just going to say that he has, amazing lineup of research, and he teaches in the area of organizational behavior and human resource interests. And he has many awards for his research, for his faculty mentorship, and for his teaching. He also as you can see from his picture, he's married with 4 children, enjoys riding his motorcycle, playing basketball, reading comic books, and is an animal lover. Yeah. And he just showed us that today with him, there is a dog that he's actually, saving from, or he's helping the dog transition from a particular kind of a role to now being an ordinary dog. So thank you very much, Billy, for agreeing to do this, and we're just all looking forward to listening to you. As of now, we have 58 participants who have logged in. That number will go up. It's already 60, but we are going to start. So thank you again for that.
Okay, thank you for that great introduction. Gosh, that was really nice. I appreciate that. I want to just real quick before I get started here, just kind of highlight a few things that you mentioned there. First, when you mentioned DEI in organizations, I think it's really important how you mentioned the transitions that we're seeing in terms of reception to DEI in organizations right now. And I'm not gonna go off on a big speech about that. I did an interview on our local Fox channel recently that's online that if people want to see my full perspective. But I will say the important thing for us to remember when we talk about DEI in organizations is it's about creating an environment where we can be inviting to all of our members of the organization and get the best out of everybody and the best outcomes for everybody. That's really what our goal is there. And if we remember that, then we really shouldn't have any controversy about whether or not DEI is a good thing. We may not agree on the best practices for how to get to that place, and those are important discussions to have, but whether or not we can get to a place where all members of our organization can be important, valued contributors should be something that most of us can agree on. The The other piece that I love that you said there is I'm going to help you get closer to the answer to your question today, right? Because no one study is ever going to give us the answer to a question. So I love that you emphasize getting closer to the question. And with that, to help us get closer to that answer, we're going to talk about the paper that Yost, Nikolai, Tanya, Paulo, and Brooke recently published in the Leadership Quarterly. It's called "Are Women Strategic Leaders More Effective During Crisis Than Men Strategic Leaders? A Causal Analysis of the Relationship." And the background causal analysis of the relationship between gender and deaths in the COVID-19 crisis. And the background of this is that if we went back to 2020, Journal of Applied Psychology had a rapid review call that they had put out for papers, because there were, and many journals had done this, right? Because we were dealing with a pandemic that was essentially something that we hadn't seen anything like it since the flu in the 1920s, really, right? And we weren't, as a society, 100% prepared for how do we respond to this. And we needed to gather information, gather data, gather best practices quickly, and get information out to the public. So as researchers, we had a strong responsibility in terms of helping to collect and disseminate information. And the Journal of Applied Psychology published a paper on the relationship between women's leadership and COVID-19 deaths. And there were two studies in the paper. The first one looked at the gender of governors in the United States, governors and leaders of territories in the United States, and the numbers of deaths in the states or territories that they govern. And then in the second piece, they did a contextual analysis of different statements that the governors had given publicly to try to see if they could explain the findings from the first study. So this paper was highly influential. At the time that we were working on our paper, this had been cited 287 times, which is quite a bit for a paper that hadn't even been published for 4 years. It was cited in the popular press extremely frequently, had a lot of impact in terms of people's perceptions on the relationship between gender and effectiveness during crisis. And it was a really important paper to be able to look at. Okay, so my team and I decided to replicate this paper, and we focused really on the first study for a few reasons. I'm going to kind of break down some of the things that caught our interest on the first study as we go through the presentation. But the reality is that there wasn't a need for us to replicate the second study without being able to replicate the first, which is why we had a focus on that, because we really wanted to see what the robustness of this effect was. Okay. Now, part of the reason that this was interesting is that on the surface, many people think, well, why does it matter whether or not women or men are more effective in a certain situation, and is there anything bad that could come out of this? But there's a lot of research on the glass cliff, right? And the glass cliff research essentially argues that women are more likely to be put into leadership positions where organizations are not successful or facing challenges, and that these are positions where people are essentially set up to fail, right? Set up to fail in multiple ways. That one, just the likelihood of the organization succeeding may not be as high, or two, as we were discussing a little bit before the presentation, even when you go into one of these glass cliff type situations and are successful, it is incredibly taxing, right? And it takes its toll on the leader. So the question here is, if we have a narrative that women are more likely to be successful in these precarious situations or during times of crisis, are they then going to be more likely to be selected and placed into these positions and then have to deal with those unintended consequences? So that was really one of the motivating factors for me as far as reinvestigating this question. And I'll tell you, earlier this week, I met with I'm not gonna name drop here because I don't want to, on a recorded presentation, use somebody's name without their permission. But I met with a highly respected scholar in the field who told me that they were really happy to see this paper because they felt like for women, the narrative that they are better in times of crisis creates a lot more pressure during crisis situations than what men experience. So, really the motivation here from a practical standpoint was considering what the unintended consequences of this narrative are, and making sure that as we talk about these relationships, that we have a true understanding of the data that's driving them. Okay, so I'm gonna walk through a few of the empirical things that raise some questions here for us as we went through the study. So if we go back through this, basically the finding from the original paper that we discussed, the Surgeon and Stojakovic paper, was that there was a negative relationship between a governor's gender and COVID-19 deaths, such that women governors had lower numbers of COVID-19 deaths than men governors did, and that there was the interaction of stay-at-home orders and governor gender was significant, such that when a woman governor issued a stay-at-home order, it had a stronger impact on reducing COVID-19 deaths than when a man governor did. Okay, so if we break that down, one of the motivating factors here was a question about potentially bad control variables in the study. And a bad control variable exists when a control variable could be influenced by the treatment directly or indirectly. And in this case, there's a question about could control variables have been influenced by governor gender directly or indirectly. And we have this table. This table is a table from our paper that shows just how there was a difference in stay-at-home orders by governor gender in different states in the United States at that time. So if we look at Surgeon and Stojakovic used 3 different levels of stay-at-home order. They had no stay-at-home order, a partial stay-at-home order, or a full stay-at-home order. And when we look at the no stay-at-home orders by gender, 53% of the men did not issue a stay-at-home order, whereas 83% of the women didn't have a stay-at-home order in their states. That's quite a difference. There wasn't a single woman governor in our data set that had a partial stay-at-home order in their state, whereas 28% of the men had partial stay-at-home orders in their state. And then the full stay-at-home order rates were actually pretty similar by gender. But these differences up here, raise some questions about are there characteristics associated with the states that women were governors of and that men were governors of that may have influenced whether or not they gave stay-at-home orders, and what type of impact could that have on our outcome variable, on our dependent variable. Another consideration that we looked at was the assumption of linearity in models. And I know we have a very diverse group of attendees here at this presentation, so I do want to say I have to get into the statistics on some of this stuff a little bit, but I will get back to the practical implications. So this is, we're going to get into some of the high level stuff, but we'll come back down to the things that matter to everybody very shortly. Okay, now when we talk about the assumption of linearity, what this basically means is they analyze their data using a model called ANCOVA. Okay, and ANCOVA it's a linear model that controls for variance associated with control variables, where it essentially extracts the variance associated with these control variables so that we can more closely isolate the relationship between our explanatory variable and our dependent variable. Now, one of the assumptions, though, in the ANCOVA model is that our control variables are going to have a linear relationship with the dependent variable. Okay, so this is a little bit problematic in the original paper that we were replicating because there were several variables that were categorical in nature that were treated like they're continuous. Okay, and to put this in a practical sense of what does that mean, that would be like imagine we had animals and we said fish is 1, cat is 2, dog is 3, and parrot's 4, and we regressed on animal. I don't know what that relationship would mean, right? Because what does it mean that fish is 1 and parrot is 4? None of us would really know what that means. And any relationship that we would find there or any variance that we could really associate between that explanatory variable and our dependent variable would be really spurious in nature. We couldn't really infer too much from that. And we have a little bit of a similar situation here with the stay-at-home variable in particular, okay? Because like I said, there were 3 levels of the stay-at-home variable. The first one was no stay-at-home order. The second one was a partial stay-at-home order, and the third one was a full stay-at-home order. Now that sounds like it's at least ordinal, right? It sounds like it goes in a progression, but if you look at what that actually means, no stay-at-home order is pretty simple. Nobody issued a stay-at-home order. A partial stay-at-home order was not a partial stay-at-home order issued by the governor. It was stay-at-home orders issued by different people within the state. So maybe a mayor within the state may have issued a stay-at-home order, or a county may have issued one. But it was basically, did another entity within the state issue a stay-at-home order? And then a full stay-at-home order was issued by the governor. So that difference between that middle level and that final level, that's really categorical, because we're not looking at different levels of what the governor did. We're looking at orders issued by different people. So it's difficult to consider that something that would have a linear relationship. And again, from that table we looked at before, we could see that there wasn't really a linear relationship within categories. Another concern that we had here with this was that the initial conditions of the pandemic weren't accounted for in the original analysis. Okay, so New York City was basically the epicenter for the disease in the United States, right? So in the United States, we had a few different places where we had our first cases. The first cases were actually identified on the West Coast, but then there were some cases that were identified in Yonkers, which is about a half an hour outside of the city early on. And then but Yonkers is a big commuting area. And then the pandemic grew quite a bit in that New York City market, right? So you have for those of you who don't know what the geography of New York is like, many of the people who commute into New York come from either Connecticut or New Jersey, and some come from Pennsylvania as well. But those 3 or 4 states have a different relationship with New York City than the rest of the country does, right? So that's something that wasn't accounted for. And if we look at the COVID-19 cases early on in the United States, you could see that they were very much centralized in that part of the country as well. So there were certain assumptions there that we had to look at as well. Now, as we say all this, I want to be very clear that we're not attacking the original research, right? That is by no means our goal. Okay, our goal in this is just to look at what are some of the other factors that could have impacted these relationships that maybe weren't considered the first time around, and what do these relationships look like if we do consider those factors. Okay, I do a lot of replication research, and I do replication research because I believe that it's important to test things multiple times with different assumptions. You know, as we discussed before the presentation, I always tell people, imagine you had heart disease and you went to the doctor and they said, I want to put you on a medication and it's been tested once. You'd do a big pause and you'd say, do you have anything that's been tested a little more rigorously, right? So that's why I engage in replication research, because it's important that we test the relationships that we're going to make decisions based on rigorously so that we can make the most informed decisions possible as managers. So really our goal here was to take Surgeon and Stojakovic found an ideal context to test this relationship, and they did a great job identifying different ways that we could test it, and we really just wanted to build on that and see what more we could learn. So as we went through this, we started with a literal replication, which is when you do your best to replicate the original analysis as closely as possible. Okay, it's considered a replication because we didn't have their original data set. We had to rebuild our own data set, so there could be differences there, and there certainly were differences. Okay, but I always start, when I do replication research, I always start with literal replications or literal reproductions. And the reason is that allows me to basically test my model as closely as possible to the original study so that I understand if there's deviations, if the deviations are because of how I'm analyzing the data, or if the deviations are because of the data I'm using, or something else. Then, after conducting a literal replication, we conducted a series of constructive replications with that data set where we removed potentially bad control variables, we accounted for the New York metro area, and we looked at linearity, looking at linear variables versus categorical variables. Then conducted a couple of constructive replications using different data sets, both that were designed to be models that we could infer causality from more rigorously, one where we used a geographic matching technique and one where we used a method called a regression discontinuity design. I'm gonna walk you through all those as we get through the presentation. Okay. So we started for our literal replication with our data reconstruction. We had to go to a few different sources to get data. So one place that we went to was the NGA website, and that's where we gathered data on the governors, on governors' attributes, including their affiliations, genders, and a variety of other control variables associated with the governors. We used the New York Times weekly COVID report, okay? And as we went through the New York Times weekly COVID report, basically that had a whole bunch, that's a data set that was on GitHub that we could go to, and it had deaths, it had interventions, it had basically most of the variables that you see in this study were available from the New York Times weekly COVID reports. And we looked at those for different dates to try to get as close as possible to the data that Surgeon and Stoyakovich used. There was a New York Times article on stay-at-home orders in late March, came out around March 23rd of 2020, that was used to determine where stay-at-home orders had been issued in the United States, and that was used for our stay-at-home order variable. And then we also used census data for things like the population. Okay. A lot of considerations that we had to factor in as far as deviations were concerned. Okay. So most of the variables that we looked at had deviations. I think the only variables that we know for certain we matched exactly to Surgeon and Stoyakovich were the gender variable. Okay, that one we were confident in, and the population variable. Okay, that one we were able to match based upon the means and standard deviations. Just about every other variable, there appeared to be minor differences. You know, for example, we could not match the mean and standard deviation for governor age initially. Okay, what I ended up figuring out, I think, was the problem there was I believe that the mayor of Washington, D.C. did not have an age inputted, and that got factored into the model as 0, because when I replaced her age with 0, that matched almost perfectly. But we can't be sure of that, so we used the correct age in our model. So there were a lot of things like that that we came across. There were challenges where, with the New York Times article on stay-at-home orders, there was a map and then there was text in the article, and the map and the text didn't always match in terms of what they said. And we used the Internet Archive to go through and look at that information from different dates to try to see when it changed. And we looked at various configurations. So I conducted a ton of sensitivity analyses to see if different constructions of these variables impacted our results. And in the end, there were more than 30 different sensitivity analyses that were run. And the results that we found that I'm going to report here today were robust in our sensitivity analyses. All right. So when we conducted our literal replication, you could see the original results from Surgeon and Stoyakovich's paper on the left, and then you could see our results on the right. And I've highlighted the governor gender and the governor gender by stay-at-home interaction there. And what you can see is there were some variations in terms of the coefficients and the standard errors, but ultimately our results were pretty close to theirs. And the p-values were within a few tenths on them. So like 0.047 versus 0.046, that type of thing. Point being that we replicated their results pretty closely. Like I said, there are some deviations in here, which we did expect because we couldn't reconstruct all their variables perfectly, but the results for rebuilding the data set independently were pretty close. So we then used that data set and started with our constructive replications. And in the first one, we moved what we thought were potentially problematic control variables. And as we did that, we ran a few different models. One where we removed all non-pharmaceutical controls. So basically every action given by a governor, whether it was a stay-at-home order, a travel ban, a face mask mandate, those types of things. We removed all those. Then another one where we reintroduced those, um, or we removed them but not the interaction. And then another one where we reintroduced all the variables and then removed the interaction. And that's the one that's on the screen here. Okay. And what you see is the results of all of them were consistent. Once we removed non-pharmaceutical control variables, the variables that we thought could vary by state for reasons other than gender, the governor gender effect became insignificant. So, anytime we remove that interaction of governor and stay-at-home order, which is the variable I was pointing out was problematic earlier because it was orders given by mayors and orders given by governors. Once we remove that interaction, the relationship between governor gender and deaths was no longer significant. In our next constructive replication, we decided to account for a potential omitted variable. And here, this is where we factored in the possibility of New York being the epicenter, actually driving this change, because the governor of New York was a man, the governor of Connecticut was a man, governor of New Jersey was a man, and the governor of Pennsylvania was a man. So you had 4 men who were governors right near the epicenter for the disease. So we added a variable that was a commuter state. And in the model you're looking at here, the commuter states were New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. We didn't include Pennsylvania in the main model because even though Pennsylvania is considered a commuter state by some, most of the sources out there focus on New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut as the primary commuter states. So we used that for our primary analysis. But the results when we included Pennsylvania were very similar, which is that essentially accounting for commuter states made the significance of governor gender disappear. You see a p-value of 0.55 on governor gender, and the governor gender by stay-at-home interaction was also failed to reach significance. That was also 0.55. Results were similar when we included Pennsylvania as a commuter state. And then we also tried it without using a commuter state, but looking at COVID-19 cases early on in the pandemic and controlling for those, because basically the interventions that we're talking about here were designed to keep cases from spreading when COVID was already there. And when we control for COVID-19 cases, the relationship between gender and death also disappeared. The other component that we talked about was accounting for the assumption of linearity. So that's this model here that I'm showing you 2C, but I'm going to go back to 2B for a second because I want to make sure that I make this point clear for anyone who hasn't been in a statistics class for a while. All right. When we have a linear variable, we get a coefficient in our model. Okay. So you can see every model we've looked at so far under this B here, we have a number, right? And that's because it's showing us if one thing goes up, what happens to the other thing, right? That's a basic assumption or the basic definition of a linear model. So as we mentioned, some of these variables really shouldn't be considered linear, like a stay-at-home variable should not be considered linear because it's about 2 different people giving orders. Okay, we ran into 2 similar things with ventilator sharing and employee travel, that those weren't necessarily linear and didn't have linear relationships with the dependent variable. So stay-at-home, domestic travel ban, face mask mandate, governor tenure and prior terms, none of these had linear relationships with the dependent variable. So when we replaced them with, when we treated them as categorical variables, once again, we failed to find a significant relationship between governor gender and deaths. Then finally, in this last set here, what we did was we took all the different things that we talked about there, the linearity assumption, the potentially problematic control variables, and controlling for the epicenter of the disease, and we put them all into one model. All right, just to see what happened when we accounted for all those pieces. So essentially, we ran a model that we would look at as ideal and said, what are the results of that? And when we ran the model that we would have considered ideal, the p-value on governor gender was almost 1. It was 0.969, indicating very, very little evidence of a relationship between governor gender and COVID-19 deaths. So, this raised some questions for us when we looked at model specification, at different types of models. How robust is this relationship to different model specifications? And from what we found here, it wasn't very robust at all. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't find a relationship, because they did find it in one model, but in the models that we ran, we were unable to replicate that relationship. Now, one of the limitations of all the work that we did here, though, is that it's still all cross-sectional. We're looking at a bunch of variables at one specific time and an outcome variable at one specific time. So it's really difficult to infer causality. So whether or not we see a relationship here, we still don't know if this is causal. So we ran a few other models to try to get better inferences of causality. Okay, so the first one, study 3A, we used what's called a geographic matching technique. Okay, and the idea behind this is that when we look at states in the United States, and I'm gonna give you a little background on states here, because I don't know how familiar everybody is with what the state construction in the U.S. is, and I know that if you just started going into the details of how things are constructed politically in India and assumed I knew everything, I would be lost in about 2 seconds. So I'm gonna just, if I oversimplify this, I apologize, but I just want to make sure that everybody who's in the presentation can follow. We've got 50 states in the U.S. They also included 5 territories. Each one of these states is very different. So if I grew up in New York, on the border of New York and New Jersey. New York and New Jersey are very different states. New Jersey, for the most part, is a commuter state. On the north part of New Jersey, you have a lot of people that commute into New York City. On the south part of New Jersey, you have a lot of people that commute into Philadelphia. There are some small rural parts of New Jersey, but for the most part, it's either small cities or suburban makeup. New York, on the other hand, in the southern part of the state is very urban, but as you go north and go west, it becomes a very rural state. So New York and New Jersey, even though they're next to each other, are very different states. However, if we were to look at Rockland County in New York and Bergen County in New Jersey, those are very, very similar counties that are ultimately divided by what we would consider like an artificial state line in many regards, right? Like people who grow up in Rockland may live in Bergen later on, they may work in Bergen and live in Rockland, and so on and so forth, but there's very strong similarities. And as we get to different parts of the country, there's actually counties in one state that had voted to try to move to a different state in other parts of the country. So, we see states form somewhat of an artificial line between counties. So what we did was we pulled data on county dyads throughout the United States. Okay, and we only looked at adjacent counties, because once you get inland into a state, those differences start to emerge between the counties. But when they're on those state borders, right across those borders, one county to the next tend to be very similar. And we only looked at dyads where the gender differed between the dyads. So, New York, New Jersey is probably not a great example here, because we actually didn't include that in our data because they both had men governors. But we had quite a few data points where we had dyads where there was a man governor in one county and a woman governor in another county, and the counties were adjacent. And we used a matching technique for counties there. Okay, ended up with 864 dyads. All right, ran our analysis both using control variables and without control variables. And in all our analyses, once again, we failed to find a relationship between governor gender and COVID-19 deaths. So this model here, because of how we match the counties, we're able to infer a little more causality from this and infer that we really did not have any strong evidence of a relationship between gender and COVID-19 deaths. All right. Now, one of the limitations here is that we've only looked at the U.S. so far, right? And the phenomenon that we have talked about the relationship between gender and leadership effectiveness is something that's relevant to the whole world. It's not a U.S. only It's not a US only effect. All right. And we've only had one causal model. So to look at this through another angle, we used a regression discontinuity design. And for this, we gathered data from Brazilian municipalities. And Brazil is an interesting context for a few reasons. One, in addition to being able to expand beyond the US, what we're able to do is look at a completely different type of environment. In Brazil, essentially, their legal structure allows mayors to have a lot more control over things like managing a pandemic and public emergencies than we see in a lot of other countries. So mayors played a really important role in the Brazilian response to the COVID-19 pandemic. All right. So what we're able to do here is we looked at municipalities where the population was less than 200,000, because when the population is more than 200,000, there are other factors that tend to impact elections in this context. And we looked at cities that had what we would call a mixed gender election. And that would be an election where the top two candidates were not the same gender. One was a man and one was a woman. The reason for that is that if we looked at cities where both candidates were men or both candidates were women, that city would be more predisposed to having a man or a woman as its mayor. Whereas if we look at cities where their most recent election was a mixed gender election, then there is some randomness as to the gender of the mayor in that city. Okay. Then what we did with this is that creates essentially like a quasi-random type experiment. And what we did with this is we ran a model called a regression discontinuity design, where we have this quasi-random experiment. And once again, we failed to find any evidence of a relationship between mayor gender and COVID-19 deaths. So we went through quite a variety of different models using 3 different data sets. And across all these models, we failed to replicate an effect. All right. When we did a literal replication, we were able to replicate the relationship between leader gender and COVID-19 deaths. But once we started to test the boundaries of that model, that effect started to disappear. All right. So, the key takeaway was that when we use more robust methodology, we were unable to detect evidence that gender is related to leadership performance in crisis. Okay, our methodological contribution for the academics in the room is that, one, assumptions in linear models do matter. Okay, for me, this is a huge point that I wanted to drive home, because I don't know if we have any PhD students in the audience today, but I know that for many of us, when we go through our PhD programs, there is a strong focus on complex models, and we almost immediately get into multi-level modeling, econometrics, very, very complex statistical modeling, right? And our OLS, our ANOVAs, our ANCOVAs, the more simple models that we look at as not being incorrect, but as being not advanced, tend to be ones that we teach quickly and don't spend a lot of time on, right? And this is a great example of where the assumptions associated with those models are demonstrated to play an important role in what our findings can look like. And then we also contribute to a research toolbox for addressing endogeneity through both the geographic matching technique and the regression discontinuity design. So often, endogeneity is the idea that we can't infer causality because there are underlying relationships between our explanatory variable and other variables out there in the model. And we think the geographic matching technique and the RDD that are common in other fields, we think that by introducing them here into leadership research and showing people how we can apply them, provide some pathways for leadership researchers and leadership scholars to do work where we have stronger justification of causality in the research that we do. Now, I know we have a lot of people from industry in the audience as well, so I want to talk a little bit about what the business implications of this research are. Okay. And the first one that I have is that you want to be cautious in how you interpret research that's reported in the news before you implement it. Okay, because often the news will pick up on a small piece of something that's in the research and it will blow up, right? We will see something will come up in a research study, it will get out there, the news will make a big deal about it, but the news the news media is not trained to break down what the limitations of the research are and to talk to you about what the contextual factors are or what statistical limitations there might have been. And your local business school could be a great resource for you in terms of, you know, there's always going to be faculty who want to partner with local businesses to conduct research and help implement things. They can be a great resource for you in terms of helping you understand what how the research you're reading about in the news applies to your context. The second piece is that research is rapidly evolving and there's no single definitive study on most topics, right? So I do a lot of replication research, and a lot of my work is about going out, looking at what we found before, and then trying to see, can we find these same results in a different context, or if we use different data, or if we apply different methodological assumptions. So, you know, no one study is ever our final answer, which is why I emphasize that I love that you said, I'm going to try to help you get closer to the answer to your questions today, but I can't actually answer the question with one study. So when you have opportunities out there to help facilitate research, whether it's through connections, funding, whatever it is, you know, obviously there's reasons to support that, even if we think we already know the answer to a question. All right. And third, we didn't find any evidence of a relationship between gender and leadership performance outside of one specific model. Okay. So please do not reserve your more precarious or less desirable positions for specific groups of people who you think will perform better in those positions, because we were unable to find any evidence that actually is the case. All right. And then finally, statistical assumptions matter. You know your data and understand how you use it beyond running a program. And I think this is something really that as AI advances, this is going to become more and more relevant to us, because as AI advances, people are going to lean on these technologies that they don't fully understand, and not being able to peel that back and understand what's happening, you know, under the hood of your statistical model, so to speak, is going to be really dangerous. So make sure you understand how your models are running. That would be my final business takeaway from this. And with that, I think we have about 15 minutes left, and really we're at a great time here to open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation. We have one question here where the person's asking, do you think that the leadership position helps better in European context, considering Angela Merkel case and New Zealand case during COVID-19? And do you have any ideas for the Indian leadership context too?
Asking if the relationship between gender and effectiveness in crisis
Yes.
holds more in those contexts. So candidly, we didn't analyze data in those contexts, so I'd be really hesitant to say one way or another what that result would be. I think one of the real interesting questions to consider with that, though, is kind of the counterfactual, right? So if we see strong women leaders who performed well in crisis, you know, do we know that they don't also perform well in non-crisis situations, or do we know that a man wouldn't have been able to perform well in that situation? This is the real challenge when we look at countries in particular, right? Is, you know, yes, we do have strong people in leadership positions, but these countries are so contextually different that it becomes really challenging to compare them like that. I think the takeaway that I would ask you to all take from this is that the data here don't indicate that women are worse leaders in crisis. They just indicate that we were unable to detect a relationship between gender and crisis effectiveness, right? So I wouldn't expect a relationship in the opposite direction. I can't speak specifically to what it would be in Europe or India because we didn't analyze those data.
Right.
However, I don't have a reason to think from a theoretical standpoint that it would be different.
Yes. And I think this whole question, it's very catchy to put this question about do are women better or are women worse leaders? And as a result, as you have rightly pointed out, it just ends up getting picked by newspapers and so on and so forth. And it possibly also ends up um, um, sort of fueling the stereotypical view of the two genders being different. And therefore, I think your research is really important in that context, that it takes us away from the emotion to the actual data for us to be able to answer that question. So thank you for that. There are two other questions that I can read out for you, and I'll do it one by one so that you
Sure.
have and so there is somebody who's asking, do you think looking at masculinity and femininity as clustered qualities would be a better question than men and women as categories?
Yeah, so I think if we were looking at traits or behaviors, that would make a lot more sense than looking at gender identity, right?
Right.
And there may be some correlations between gender and different traits or behaviors, but I think looking at traits or behaviors would make a lot more sense
Right.
than looking at gender identity. And it would be a lot more useful, right? Because we could train people to enact different behaviors. I mean, I
Right.
think we talked about empathy earlier. I'm a more empathetic person now than I was when I was younger. I learned to be empathetic because I learned about I learned about the impact of it, right?
Yes,
Uh, so I think, yeah, that absolutely would be a much more useful thing for us to research.
absolutely. Here is a PhD student, Atul, who's asking a question, and this is a more related to the method. And he's saying, how did geographic matching and regression discontinuity design improve causal inference as compared to the previous studies?
Yeah, so you want to think about it like you're like almost like you're mimicking an experiment. Okay. So when you look at say geographic matching, we'll say if I have two counties that are on borders of different states, and maybe those states are, gosh, I wish I had a map in front of me. I feel like I'm going to say two states that don't actually border each other, but maybe it's Ohio and Indiana, right? And I have one county that's in one state, one county that's in another, and they have governors that are different genders. Um, those counties are typically going to be so similar in so many ways that the
Yes,
gender of the governor is semi-random to the county. So that's how it becomes more like an experiment, which is why we could infer more causality. Whereas when we look at other things, when we look at the bigger model, there are bigger differences between states. Like California is very different from Texas. Right. We'll say like that would be an example there. And then the
right.
RDD is basically the same type of situation because we have a contested election between a man and a woman where the election was fairly close. So it's quasi random. Okay, it's not fully random, but we would call it quasi random. Um, like I said earlier, we didn't include municipalities where the contested election was not mixed gender. So if all the people who were in contention to be mayor were men, or all the people who were in contention to be mayor were women, they were not included. So, even though the people in the municipality chose the mayor, it was still quasi random in that
Yes.
sense because it was a close contested election.
Yeah, I've read through your paper, and I think you very nicely, cleverly kind of picked out the fact that it is, how it could be seen as quasi-random,
Hmm.
and also looked at the election results as a way to talk about it. So I think that's very nice. I mean, the way you've thought about it, I think it was Freud who said that I'm more of an explorer rather than a scientist. And you kind of uh, are on both. You're exploring and you're using the scientific method to possibly ask the question, and that's an interesting combination that you're doing. Here's another
Yeah,
question, and
I
I
think.
would
Oh,
just
I was just going to say that if I can just add one clarifying
yes,
point on that, is that none of these are perfectly randomly assigned, right? So
absolutely,
that and that is why it's important for us to use multiple models, because when we
yes.
use multiple models like this, it helps us kind of triangulate our position. So so it was a great question from the student.
I think there's one more question, and that's about, and I'm not very sure about the question myself, but the question is, can you elaborate on age as a parameter? So, Atul, if you could explain the question more, or Dr. William, if you have a way of answering it, be nice.
Age, like the governor's age, is that the question?
I think that's the question, the age, governor's age as a parameter. Oh, sorry, this is by Ulka. Ulka. Sorry, Ulka, if you can answer that, explain the question more. Um, Wait for them to write. So while we're waiting for this question to be answered or to be explained, I'm hoping she's still there. Um, yeah, so you have age.
Yeah, so age was I mean, I'll while we're waiting for it to come up in the chat, I'll talk about age in the model a little bit. So age was a control variable in the original study, and you can see it in here. And when you look at the coefficients and the standard errors on age, in the original study was the coefficient was negative 9.18, the standard error of 28.25. In our study, we had a little bit of a bigger negative coefficient, a little bit of a bigger standard error, not a significant influence there. So, we really only included it because it's a replication. We were including
Sure.
the controls from the original study. And then if we go back to, we talked about removing control variables and things of that nature. But no matter what we did with any of our models, age was never a significant factor. Even in
Correct.
you see a p-value of 0.55 in this model, a p-value of 0.43 in this model. It's not something
Yeah,
that we found to be a very influential factor. But one thing that you want to remember is, and I don't have the data right in front of me at this moment, but there tends to be a fairly narrow range that you're going to see for the ages of governors, which could also be one of the reasons that we don't see a strong relationship there. There just might not be enough variance in that small sample for us to see that.
sure. Sure, thank you. And I think that's the question, that's the explanation for the question as well that's given. So it doesn't seem age or gender matter in terms of more effectiveness, something else does. Great. I think I also want to quickly introduce to you Dr. Professor Elizabeth George, who's also joined as on the panel here. And she's also part of the advisory council of the center. And so I'd like to welcome her, and if she has any questions, be very happy for her to ask a question. Um, and if I'm sorry to put you on spot, Professor George, but if you'd like to, you're very welcome to. Otherwise, I have another question that I can read out.
No, I just thank you. You did put me a bit on the spot, but thank you. I thought it's a really interesting presentation, and I enjoyed it very much. I was also intrigued by the fact that the dependent variable, which is death, explained by the drawing a string between gender and death as the outcome is like a long shot. So I'm not surprised that the constructive replication, which I really admire how it's done, didn't pan out the way it did. But I wonder if you measured effectiveness in other ways, if there was, if there is some measure of panic or measure of confidence in the government. I don't know, some other measure of effectiveness, if gender would predict that. Just a thought, but Thank you for a very, very interesting presentation.
Yeah, so I think that's, oh, you're welcome, and thank you for having me. Really glad to be here today. I think that that's a great point, that there could be other components to this that we would want to look at that might be closer to that, right? Like one thing that could be interesting if we could get to it, and I don't have data on this, but I'm just like thinking through it, is do we have social media responses to different announcements, right? Like did people respond to men and women differently? That could be something. So there's a Drew Carton and Ashley Rosette did a paper years ago where they looked at how the media wrote about different leaders based on using race as the explanatory variable. And they found that the media described different leaders differently. And there was a Park, I can't remember, Park and Westfall had a similar paper where they looked at analyst responses to CEOs, things like that. So maybe there would be a potential opportunity to look at how people speak on social media in response to different leaders, but we didn't have those data.
Right. I think, thank you, Professor George. I think there's another very similar question on the chat box where they're asking, how do you define effectiveness in crisis leadership? And is it based, so the question is, could it be based on financial performance, employee morale, long-term stability, and how do we objectively measure it across genders? So I think it's very interestingly, so the whole question of, can we also define effectiveness differently? And will that change the results?
Well, I think we could surely define effectiveness differently, right? I think the challenge when we define effectiveness differently is how do we define it in such a way that is not confounded by bias, right? Because if we get into employee trust, trust could be confounded by bias, right? So we'd want to be careful, and it would be valuable to know that information. Don't get me wrong, but are there measures that we can look at? Financial performance is probably going to be a little more objective than some more subjective variables like trust or employee satisfaction or turnover intentions, but they all probably have value, right? And what would be really interesting, I think, is if you have some of these variables that could be confounded by bias, if they showed one thing, but your more objective variables showed another, then we start to open the door to what do we have to do to bridge the gap between these, right? So that could be useful in the sense of identifying problems that we have to solve that we haven't fully recognized too. So I think there's a lot of different ways that we could explore this question for sure.
Great, thank you. I think we are pretty much at a time boundary, so thank you very much for your really interesting talk and the work that you've done. I would now request Professor Sonali to give the vote of thanks, please.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
On behalf of the team at Ashang Desai Center for Leadership and Organizational Development at IIM Ahmedabad, I sincerely extend our gratitude towards Professor William for not only readily accepting our invite, but also being very kind to us throughout the process and sharing with all of us his brilliant piece of research work, which is not only topic-wise intriguing, but also very, very thought-provoking methodologically. I'm sure that all the academicians and practitioners, industry people available today attending this session have gained immensely from this. A special mention to the Zoom team for facilitating a seamless session. Not last but not the least, thank you very much to all the attendees for joining us for the session today. I'm sure all of you have gained today from this session. At Ashang Desai Center for Leadership and Organizational Development, our team is dedicated to curating such sessions regularly, which we lovingly call or label as the Deep Dive Leadership Research Talks, where we invite renowned researchers across the world to share their thought and research work with all of us. Therefore, in the future, also, we hope to see all of you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you all. It's my honor to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this research, and you've been great hosts. I appreciate you.
All right. So until next time, thank you, everyone. And hopefully, we will be in touch, Dr. William, about more research and thoughts about your work. Thank you.